This evening promised to be perfect, and with each step toward the bathroom, I could feel the fatigue dissipating, replaced by a much-needed calm. After a busy day spent taking care of my sister, her baby, and countless household chores, I was finally able to carve out some time for myself. The bathroom was softly lit, the soft glow of candles creating gentle shadows on the walls. The subtle scent of lavender permeated the air, carrying me away from the chaos of everyday life. I inhaled deeply and gradually sank into the warm water, feeling it envelope me. Closing my eyes, I let my thoughts wander, disconnected from the world around me. The night seemed to belong to me alone, and nothing could disturb the moment, but soon something in the house alerted me. At first it was an almost imperceptible sound, a subtle rustle, like someone treading carefully on the floor behind a closed door. The house made that sound sometimes, but this time it was different. The footsteps seemed to be getting closer. I kept my eyes closed, trying to convince myself that it was just old floorboards or the wind. But then I heard something else, like someone holding their breath at the bathroom door, and a chill ran down my spine. I cautiously lifted myself up and looked at the door. A thin strip of light from the hallway shone beneath it. It was quiet at first, but soon I noticed a shadow crossing the strip. The movement was too slow and cautious to write it off as accidental. My heart clenched, and I gripped the edge of the tub, anxiety building in my chest. Still, I dared to speak. "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud in the silence, and was followed only by a strange sound, as if someone was slow to answer. After a few long seconds, a voice came from behind the door. "It's me." It was my nephew. At the sound of his voice, the tension eased, and I relaxed and exhaled. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "Just give me a minute, I'll be right out." I heard footsteps outside the door, and then silence again. But something in his voice struck me as odd. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but his words sounded different than usual. Calming down a little, I plunged back into the water, trying to regain the calm I'd lost. The warmth of the water enveloped me again, and I took slow, deep breaths, trying to let go of the lingering anxiety. I stared at the flickering candlelight, watching the shadows dance on the walls, and tried to focus on the present moment. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard the sound again. This time it was closer. My heart pounded with renewed vigor. I forced myself to turn toward the door, and at that moment, a shadow appeared in the opening beneath the door. It seemed frozen in place, as if someone was just standing there and not moving. "Are you here again?" I asked, trying to remain calm, but my voice shook. There was silence, and I held my breath again, listening to the barely perceptible, but definitely present breathing behind the door. A quiet, steady sound, too close, too insistent. Fear gripped me with renewed vigor, and a thought flashed through my mind. It wasn't my nephew. The door opened slowly, revealing a thin slit. Shaking with fear, I realized I had locked it. It couldn't have been an accident. My heart was pounding so hard that its beats seemed to be audible in the silence. I struggled to get out of the water and wrapped a towel around myself and walked to the door, barely breathing. Carefully, I pushed it open, and it slowly swung open, revealing an empty, dark hallway with no one in it. "Hello." My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was no answer. I looked around, trying to remain calm, but my hands were shaking. The darkness of the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the dim light from the bathroom barely penetrating past the doorway. At that moment, my nephew appeared from his room, his face expressing confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, and I could tell by his demeanor that he had no idea what had just happened. I sighed, feeling both relieved and lingering anxiety at the same time. "It's nothing," I said, trying to brush it off. "I thought I heard something." He looked at me curiously but didn't continue. I quickly threw on my robe and went back into the house, trying to calm my sudden anxiety and figure out what had thrown me off balance. Later, as we sat in the living room in silence, The ticking of the clock was the only sound to break the tension. I replayed the events in my head, trying to make sense of them. My nephew looked calm, his gaze fixed on the floor. I noticed his shoulders slumped slightly, as if an invisible weight was resting on them. "You're back early," I finally said, trying to lighten the mood. He nodded briefly, his expression unreadable. We ended up having dinner together, but something wasn't right. He was unusually quiet, and I couldn't shake the strange tension hanging in the air. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery against plates, which reinforced the silence between us. After dinner, he suddenly looked at me, a mixture of emotions reflected in his eyes. "I'm sorry if I scared you earlier," he said quietly. I don't know. Everything seems different lately." I looked up at him, noticing the vulnerability in his expression. His eyes were downcast, and his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay," I replied softly. "We all have moments like this. Just remember you're not alone." He smiled weakly, hesitantly, and I could see that there was a weight on his shoulders that he hadn't yet found the words to tell me about. I wished I could reach out and lift some of that burden from him, but I knew it wasn't that easy. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that lurked in my mind. Something had changed, something I couldn't fully understand. As I lay in bed that night, I listened to the silence in the house, and in my mind I replayed the memory of the shadow at the door over and over again. Whatever happened tonight, I knew it wasn't over, and that thought kept me awake, staring into the darkness. The shadows seemed to take on new shapes as I stared at the ceiling, and every creak of the house made me flinch. I tried to focus on my breathing to calm my nerves, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The memory of the shadow under the door flashed through my mind again, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was really my imagination. My nephew's strange behavior was even more confusing. There was something he wasn't telling me. It seemed to be something weighing heavily on his mind. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The world outside seemed so peaceful, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to take comfort in the silence, but it was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned away from the window and went back to bed, hoping that sleep would someday come. The next morning, the feeling of unease never left me. The house was quiet. The events of the previous night seemed like a distant dream, but the anxiety in my chest was all too real. I went downstairs and found my nephew already sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his teacup. When I walked in, he looked up and smiled tiredly. "Good morning," he said in a barely audible voice. "Good morning," I replied, studying his face. He had dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting down across from him. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep," he said, lowering his gaze to his cup. There was something he wasn't telling me, and I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I wanted to press him, to ask him what was really bothering him, but I held back. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand on his arm. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," I said softly. He raised his eyes to me, a mixture of emotions splashed in them, gratitude, fear, and something else I couldn't identify. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He jerked his hand away and stood up abruptly. "I think I'm going for a walk," he said, avoiding my gaze. I watched him leave the room, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something was wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, but my thoughts kept returning to the events of the night before. The shadow at the door, the strange tension with my nephew, it was like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. I glanced toward the hallway every now and then, half expecting to see the shadow again, but there was nothing there. That night, as I lay in bed again, the feeling of unease returned. I listened to the silence in the house, every creak and rustle amplified in the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The memory of the shadow under the door popped into my head again and again, and I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might break the silence. Just as I was about to doze off, I heard the sound again, a quiet rustle, a faint sound coming from the hallway. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I pulled myself up, listening intently, and I heard the sound again, a quiet, deliberate sound, as if someone was moving cautiously through the house. The fear that had gripped me the previous night was back, stronger this time. I realized I could no longer ignore it. Slowly getting out of bed, I stood barefoot on the floor. I opened the bedroom door and looked out into the dark hallway. There was silence in the house, but I could feel it, a presence, a sense that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, looking around at the darkness. The air seemed heavy, the shadows deeper than they should have been. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely audible. There was no response, but the feeling that I was being watched was unmistakable. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The corridor stretched out in front of me, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I reached the bathroom door, and my hand trembled as I turned the knob. The door swung open, revealing an empty bathroom, the candles lit the previous night still on the counter. I exhaled, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But when I turned to leave, I saw his just for a moment, a shadow moving at the end of the hallway. My breath caught, and I froze, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen it. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of unease remained, stronger than ever. I realized, whatever was happening, it wasn't over. The shadow, the strange tension with my nephew, the feeling that I was being watched, it was all connected, and I could no longer ignore it. I had to find out what was going on, no matter how much it scared me. Taking a deep breath, I turned and walked back to my room, determined to face whatever lay ahead.